Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and with me today is JC Glick, retired Army Ranger Lieutenant Colonel. He is a leadership, strategy, and culture advisor, as well as CEO of the Commit Foundation, an organization that helps high-performance veterans find their next adventure. And Nevel is Vice President of Education for a trade association and enjoys connecting the right people to the right projects to promote successful collaboration and partnership. And all the way from New Zealand is Andre van Heerden, Director of the Power of Integrity Leadership Development Program and author of multiple books on leadership. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Here.
Thanks for having me.
Here is our topic for today. Last week, Joseph Tyler was sentenced to 8 years in state prison and ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to older Coloradans after he defrauded them in a tree trimming scam after pleading guilty to 51 counts of theft targeting at-risk victims, a Class 3 felony, and to theft, a Class 5 felony. In other headlines, cryptocurrency CEO and billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried faces the possibility of 100 years in prison for fraud and embezzlement. According to claims, hundreds of thousands of investors suffered irreparable financial harm, which Bankman-Fried denies, and for which he has expressed no remorse. Many compare him to Bernie Madoff, who received an effective life sentence for massive embezzlement and subsequently died in prison. Meanwhile, reports of unenforced shoplifting laws fill the headlines in cities across the U.S. The state prosecutor in Florida reportedly has a history of downgrading or dropping charges in serious criminal cases, resulting in released offenders committing more egregious crimes. She was recently suspended by Governor Ron DeSantis. In Chicago, a convicted felon awaiting trial for murder has been released with electronic surveillance, while a businessman with no criminal record has been held in solitary confinement for 18 months over a divorce dispute. On the one hand, we want white-collar criminals to be held accountable, not merely get a slap on the wrist. On the other hand, there seems to be a disproportionate response showing more leniency towards violent offenders. Inevitably, any perception of inequity undermines respect for the law, sows distrust in our judicial system, and contributes to a less stable society. So, how do we address the apparent inequities of justice in an effort to preserve or restore confidence in our systems? Lots of ways we can jump into this one. The floor is open.
Who wants to start?
All right. Well, I'm never afraid to start, Rabbi. I thought a lot about this as soon as I saw it, and there's so many different ways to go, right? So what's the purpose of punishment, right? Is it to punish, or is it for justice, or is it for rehabilitation, or what are we really trying? What's the outcome? What's the intended outcome? And then, is it different for other people? Are we looking at real or perceived privilege in some places, and the abuse of that privilege, meaning there needs to be greater judgment, there needs to be greater justice. And it's very interesting, because here we are, and I was literally just having this conversation. You know, I just moved to New York, spent my whole life around weapons, as trained. If in New York, because I haven't filled out my permit for a weapon, if I am near or touch a handgun, like I go to a range and I shoot someone else's, it's against the law.
Really?
Now, it was either last night or the night before last, an NYPD officer was killed in Queens, shot in the belly, by a guy who's got 21 felony convictions, or 21 felony arrests. I don't know how many convictions. I didn't see that. To include gun charges. He has a gun. And you sit there and you go, okay, I can listen to a whole bunch. Justice is in the eye of the beholder, and fair is not always equal, and equal is not always fair. But at what point are we saying, like, hey, let's get rid of the hypocrisy. If it's wrong, it's wrong, period. We're not going to do this. Because to a certain point, what you'll get is the people who are going to follow the law are going to follow the law. And then the criminals aren't. So then you've got to say, okay, so justice then should it be harsher then? Or the people that, make the mistake, or, hey, I didn't know I shot my buddy's gun. Do I need justice on that guy? That's a hard question for me. And the hypocrisy of where we're at, which is, okay, it's okay if you do this, but it's really bad if you do that. And you look at, again, the case that you mentioned, protected population. Yeah, it's disgusting. He should be punished. So should the guy who just shot this, who had 21 other arrests. He probably should have been punished before this.
And it's on the one hand, it's apples and oranges. I mean, it's reprehensible to take advantage of older people and defraud them of savings, and that there's something that we really, really respond to. What kind of person does this? What kind of predator takes advantage of older people by earning their trust and then betraying it? But how do you compare that with taking somebody's life? They're in completely different categories, and yet we sort of struggle with the concept of justice, how it's equally applied. Annie, you look like you have something on your mind.
Yeah, no, because I was going to talk about some things a little. I don't disagree with what JC was saying, and I was going to talk about some different things from experiences as well. In one case, I was a criminology major in college, and I think my professor would love to know that I still remember when Dr. Bedard shared with us a poem on consequences. And so the whole thing, so it's kind of related to what you were saying, JC, that like the consequences for, the one person who committed the crime is going to be very different than the just like they were talking about in some of these cases that, yeah, they may have paid restitution, but what is that going to do to a guy who has millions of dollars or whatever? That's not going to have the same consequences, where if this guy who, defrauded several people, just kind of, sometimes we don't know all of the story. What are going to be the consequences of him going, sometimes that's what happens. What's the consequences of him actually being incarcerated? So interesting story that I'll make really quickly is that I was actually on a jury as well in a similar case. And while I had very strong feelings, and I also think this has a lot to do with a lot of all of this too, juries are humans and your peers, or supposedly, and because I was educated and I had strong feelings about certain things, I made a decision because I knew what the consequences were going to be for someone who was going to go to prison. It was a very different case. I mean, it was like it was a vehicle, it was a lemon law thing, it was something like that. And the consequences were going to be that this guy, who also had a special needs child at home, was going to be sent to prison, and so to me, the consequences it didn't make sense. So I have a lot of things around this, so I feel like I'm not getting all of my thoughts. I'm kind of like all over the place, but I think consequences is a big thing as far as this goes. And I think, as far as just this conversation in general, humans and human nature and people's actions, and the jury of your peers has a lot to do with a lot of these things as well. So.
Well, what I think I hear from your story, Anne, if I understood it rightly, you felt that the person was guilty, but you felt that the consequences were inappropriate, either out of proportion or there were extenuating circumstances. So then you get into the ethical question, do I vote not guilty even though I think the person's guilty, because I don't think justice will be served through the punishment.
Absolutely. And I will tell you, I was the person who held this up because I didn't think that the consequences were, it was actually, yeah, the consequences of him going to prison for what he had actually done. And in this case, I would really struggle with the one that we talked about, tree trimmers. I would really struggle with that. But I think that that's part of all of this, is knowing the whole story and what the consequences are. So I have a lot of thoughts all over the place.
Well,
That's
we've
kind of
got
where
some
I
time
started.
left. Andrew?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't find anything that JC said that I disagree with, and I don't disagree with anything Anne has said. I think it was Gandhi who said that justice without mercy is cruel, and mercy without justice is reprehensible as well. So we can't separate the two. We've got to have mercy there. We've got to be compassionate if we claim to be civilized. But justice is very important. And I think we've got to realize that I don't want to sound apocalyptic here, but the Western world is not in a good way and hasn't been for some time. You know, who was it back in the 1990s who wrote the book, The End of History, saying because the Soviet Union had fallen over and Nazism had been defeated 45 years earlier, that now the whole world was going to become a great, happy, liberal democracy. Well, I mean, you know, his keyboard had hardly curled down, and you got all the trouble in the Balkans and the Middle East and so on. So liberal democracy is going through that crisis now, and you can see it with liberal democratic governments throughout the West, in Europe, in America, in Canada, in New Zealand, Australia, becoming far more authoritarian. So when we talk about justice, we've got a real problem, because justice has been politicized, just like academia has been politicized. And the injustices you were talking about, JC, arise from political decisions imposed in a court of law. And that's obviously unjust. And of course, it's made worse by the fact that people on social media erupt when they see these manifest violations of basic justice. Personally, I don't believe the comparisons are really helpful, because we know injustice when we see it. And I think each case, getting back to the idea of justice and mercy, has to be judged on its own merits. But justice, and I'd like to throw this out there, we've got to have a clear definition of what we mean by justice before we can really resolve this issue. I don't think we're going to resolve it, because it's become politicized. And, you know, with the divisions in Western society at the moment, you've got it in New Zealand, in Australia, Britain, Europe, all over the Western world. You've got these divisions. It's, call it a cultural conflict, if you like. But until that is resolved, and until the West can once more come up with a defining idea to which all people will cling and observe, I don't think we're going to solve these issues.
Yeah, it seems how just about everything comes back to politics. You know, I'm a political moderate, which I define as somebody who has no friends. But I do have a lot of acquaintances on both sides, and it's so remarkable to me that, you know, I hear my friends who are more liberal complaining about the conservative justices on the Supreme Court are destroying the country, and my friends on the right are complaining about how the liberal justices are trying to destroy the country, and there just doesn't seem to be any room for moving forward. We just keep, you know, this keeps coming back to the same things again and again.
That's the essence of our problem.
Yeah, you know,
And as I say, I think the best contribution we can make is to define what we mean by justice.
So subjective of what, you know, what justice looks like. And I think rightfully so that it's subjective in this time, because I think we've looked at it from one perspective for a very long time, and maybe we've ignored another perspective. So maybe the justice that we were all comfortable with requires it to be challenged in a way that it is being challenged right now, right? People balk at the term privilege. And I'm going to be honest with you. I did too initially. And then I really start to look at, no, I do have certain privileges. Now, some of them are earned, some of them are not earned. And it's forced me to look at, okay, so was this just? And look, the truth of the matter is, sometimes it's not, and it's just the way the world works, right? I mean, it's just what happens. Your comment, though, first of all, mercy and justice. Thank you. I love that. I can't wait to go like use that somewhere, because it was absolutely beautiful. But it made me think of where we're at right now. Hard times create hard men. Hard men create good times. Good times create soft men. Soft men create hard times. And I think we're in that kind of hard times place. And some of it, you know, I want to go back to, you know, hey, you thought the consequence was harsher, like the judge, like there's justice, right? Justice and judgment. And in my mind, you know, as a military guy, I was, for a lot of stuff, I was judge, jury, and executioner, right? So I had, you know, UCMJ authority, Uniform Code of Military Justice Authority. So I would adjudicate, like you'd come, you'd tell me what mitigated the incident, and I would decide what happened to you. And a lot of times I'd say, no, you're definitely guilty. You did this. And they're like, yeah, okay. And the punishment, let's say it was half a month's pay for 2 months. And they would come to me and they would go, you are taking money out of my children. I have 2 children. I have a wife. And my response to that was, I'm not doing that. You did that. This guy who broke the law and was going to go to jail and had a special needs kid, maybe that's something he should have thought about before he did this thing. And because what I find a lack of today, and I think my wife would back me up on this, you know, she's an attorney, personal accountability does not exist in today's society. I will do something and it's somebody else's fault. And when I get caught, the outcome, well, you can't do, like, that's such a harsh outcome. Well, that's what it says we're supposed to do. Like, that's like, what was your role in this? And I wonder, should we be talking about justice, which is subjective, to personal accountability, which is objective, right? I take accountability for the actions that I did, as opposed to the justice piece, which, man, I think we're probably 4 people who are probably pretty similar. I know I'm similar to Rabbi. I'm very moderate, but I bet you we'll disagree on what's just on some stuff. I don't know. It's just something that when I heard the mercy and justice thing, I went, oh my gosh, what a beautiful, that was beautiful.
I think yeah. Oh,
Sorry.
that's okay. I was just going to say, I do think that I feel like we could all agree on the accountability piece, because I could get, once you said that, I'm like, I could go through each one of them and go, yep, that sucks that you're in that situation right now, but you probably shouldn't have done that to start with. And instead of looking at the justice side of it, looking at the accountability piece. So thanks for sharing that. Go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, I think accountability really comes through in Plato's definition of justice, and frankly, I think we need to get back to classical natural law if we are to have any hope of restoring Western society. You know, we're going through a revolution, whether we like it or not. It's been going on. You know, if you look at the French Revolution, people date it normally starting at 1789. when in fact the revolution there had been going on for a decade before, with your aristocrats, your nobility in France actually causing the revolution by their actions. So I think we are going through a revolution now, and I think your establishment elites are basically clinging on to power. And of course, they're facing problems from all sides. So don't expect the authoritarianism to get any better. But I believe Plato's definition of justice is a lot more objective than you might suggest, JC. He said justice is giving to each what is due to them. In Latin, suum cuique, which, you know, when you think about it, if I do something wrong, what is due to me? What is my due? What do I deserve? I deserve punishment. Yes, there might be reasons that you want to show me mercy, and that's well and good. But your starting point is what is due to someone. So someone who's got a good job. I'm not a socialist. Let me state that right up front. But I do believe that I believe a lot of capitalists, I believe a lot of businessmen create all the social dysfunction we suffer within our societies by paying abysmal wages. You know, you had that spectacular case in the States with Amazon, where this country, the company is doing amazingly well. It's making money hand over fist, but a lot of its workers are actually on food stamps. You know, there's something obviously wrong there. That's unjust. They are not getting what is due to them. So Plato's definition, I think, is really important, and we should all cling to that. But of course, while you've got a politicized justice system, you're not going to get that, because what is being done is obviously unjust. And the trouble is, as Jonathan said earlier, if you have injustice and it is seen by people, confidence is lost, trust is lost, and your society breaks down. And it might go as far as, it does go as far as vigilantism. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really compelling line. You know, I don't quote Karl Marx very often, but you know, when he said that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction, you know, it doesn't have to. The problem is, I like to paraphrase Churchill that you know, capitalism is the worst system except for all the others, but we can see so clearly how its abuse is leading to injustice and a lack of trust and a breakdown of society. As an illustration I like to use, you know, two shoplifters come into court before a judge, and the judge says to one of them, you know, well, you know, before I sentence you, tell me about yourself. He says, well, my father was an armed bank robber, and my grandfather was a mafia kingpin, and my great-grandfather was a serial killer. And the judge says, oh, and you're just a shoplifter? Well, not so bad. And the other guy, what about you? He says, well, my father was a rabbi, and my grandfather was the head of the court, and then my great-grandfather ran an institution of higher learning. I said, you're a shoplifter? You know, two people do the same thing. And, you know, to your point about privilege, JC, when we have advantages, it does impose a certain amount of responsibility on us. But the problem is that when we say justice is blind, which goes all the way back to scripture, don't favor the rich, don't favor the poor, don't favor the well-off, don't favor the challenged. If we had judges we could trust, or if we had judges we trust, then we'd be more willing to say, let's leave it to the discretion of the judge. But because of the politics, we see our judges as inept or unreliable or having political agendas. And therefore, we focus on all of the miscarriages of justice, especially when they're trumpeted in the media.
Yeah.
I think though, and first of all, I have to caveat this with you're two of the best people I could possibly be on with, the both of you making me think so much. I love this. But even in Plato's definition there, and he talks in the Republic, there's four kind of pieces that he hits about justice, and it's really about being good, right? Justice is about being good. The problem
Absolutely.
is, and this is my problem with why I think it's subjective. Good to you is not necessarily good to me. And I can sit there, and even when you talk about the Amazon case, and I don't know that I'd fight it real hard, but I can see the other side, which is, well, the owner of Amazon is taking all the risk. He's the one that's going to really lose out, and the worker will have another opportunity to get a job somewhere else. And so an argument can be made that, well, that's not unjust. It might not be fair, but it's not unjust
That's
because
an interesting distinction.
but well, and I think that's the problem with justice and fairness, because what's fair? It depends. Like I say lots of stuff to my kids that they think is unfair. That's their perspective, right? You and I might have justice. You might say to your kids, hey, if you swear, you're going to be punished. My kids in my house, I might let them swear and not even think about it. It doesn't require a punishment in my case. So I think what we do have to get to is a place where, as a Buddhist, I'm going to tell you right and wrong. Like I don't see right and wrong. I see action that we put value on. However, in a social contract, I think we have to have the same value label as part of our social contract, where we all agree, hey, you know what? What you're saying about Amazon, we're all going to agree that's right and it's unjust. And then we're going to do something about it. But I think we have to get to, look, we understand it's subjective, but in social contract, we're all going to agree this is how we will live. And I mean, that is what Plato talked about is, don't be a despot where the strong determine what justice is. Have social contract where we determine what is just.
Yeah, if I could just say that Plato didn't suggest social contract. So the social contract is about 500 years old. It came in with Hobbes and Locke, and they came up with the idea. And they had to come up with some idea. I mean, Hobbes in Leviathan said, look, if you've got everyone doing their own thing, and that was liberalism started 500 years ago with Descartes, cogito ergo sum, and so on. For 500 years, we've tried this liberal experiment, and it's been, politically, it's been expressed in different ways. But the basic idea of liberalism is the detached, autonomous individual. And that's why everything that you're speaking about is subjectivity. Prior to that, that's not the way they thought, and that's certainly not the way Plato thought. They believed there was objective good and evil. There was good things for human beings and bad things. So what changed completely was the Western world suddenly getting this idea of the detached, autonomous individual who is free to make their own choices in all regards. Now, if you have that, then you need the all-powerful state to stop the war between all with all. And that was the idea. Now, Locke came up with a more liberal idea and not as harsh as Leviathan. But that's what we're struggling with at the moment. I mean, how can you possibly have a nation holding together if people don't agree basically on the difference between right and wrong? And the result has been that now they look to the state to tell them what's right and wrong. And how can you trust the state? How can you trust these embezzlers and corrupt politicians to tell us what is right and wrong? The only way out of this is to go back to the precepts of natural law. Let me give you the easiest example. You all know the golden rule, which is accepted it's called the golden rule because it's accepted in every society known to history. And it's simple. Treat others as you want to be treated. Now, which government came up with that? In other words, it precedes government.
Mhm.
Love
It
your
is a
numbers yourself.
precept of natural law. And we can find lots of things. Once, natural law is based on human nature. We are human beings by nature. Now, what do we need naturally? What is our purpose? We can work out. We are rational animals. That is our nature. So what do we need? Well, we need meaning. We need purpose. We need freedom. We need employment. We need community. We need all sorts of things. We can work these out rationally and objectively. And it transcends culture. On my workshops, I have had well over 40 different ethnic groups, and never once have I had disagreement with the precepts of natural law. They all agree with them. 40 different cultures, but they all agree on what is right and wrong.
Well, the challenge then is the application, right? Is when you have competing values, how you prioritize, and then there's an inclination to devalue the values that are not priorities, which I think makes things much more combative. Ann, you want to get a word in here?
No, I think JC was gonna say something, so I don't wanna.
No, please.
No, the only thing I was gonna say is I thought Andre wasn't gonna talk very much when I first met him, so very surprised. No, I don't really have anything to add. I think this has been a very interesting conversation, going in a totally different direction than what I would have expected as these do. Yeah, I don't have anything to add right now that I can.
JC, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm excited that you've had that experience where people didn't disagree with that kind of universal law. That has not been my experience traveling all over the world. I've seen cultures that do things that are abhorrent in Western cultures, and that is just part of their culture. It is who they are. The golden rule, the law of reciprocity. It's good and bad, right? If you look at it as in Islamic texts, the golden rule is more about an eye for an eye. Okay, it's less about treat somebody the way you want to be treated. It's more like if you're harmed, do harm. Is how I have understood it. But what I will say is that I worry about universal law or natural law because I think culture plays a huge part in that. And I think in most Western cultures, and it's why, maybe I'm not I would never be asked to go on a mission trip because I've been in places where they had the people, good people, by all accounts, good people in the society were doing things that nobody on this call would find acceptable. In fact, not only would we not find it acceptable, we would find it absolutely disgusting. And yet it is an accepted thing in their culture. And are they bad because something that we believe is bad they do in their culture? I'm not ready to vilify a whole people based on something that I disagree with. And we can call this situational ethics or not. But I think that we have to be very thoughtful as, clash of civilizations, as the world gets smaller. We have to be very careful on thinking that, in my mind, there is a right and a wrong. I don't know that there is. I think there is a spectrum. I think that to agree on that and and I may even argue that social contract was thought of before it was solidified and by Locke. But that's a separate issue that we'll do on another podcast. I hope, Rabbi, I'd like to have that one. But I think that when we start talking about, we've got to go back to natural law again. I think that there's got to be a discussion on where does that start? Who is included in that conversation? And can we get to a universal understanding, or at least a world understanding of, yep, these are going to be what we're going to go for? Because even if we look today at what's going on in our world, what's happening in the Sudan, what's happening in Israel and Gaza, what happens in the United States, I think there's a whole bunch of people that think it's right and a bunch of people that think it's wrong. And it depends on what side you're on. And I think that until we get to a point where I can hear everything you're saying and go, yeah, there's truth to that. And I could probably come to a mutual understanding where I'm not 100% happy. Maybe you're not 100% happy, but we'll move forward. I think we're going to look at subjectivity.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up by putting on my rabbi's hat, and then we'll save further conversation for the second segment. But from our point of view, and I think from a logical point of view as well, if there isn't an agreed upon higher authority, then all discussion is going to be subjective. Right? You can claim natural law, but what happens when we don't agree on what natural law is? It's the necessity of an ultimate authority. And there was a time when that was much more universal than it is now. We've become more fractious than ever. I mean, that wonderful phrase in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I wonder how many of those there are anymore. Truths that we can agree on are self-evident. And I think when we talk about morality, that really we're attempting to tap into some ultimate truth. When we talk about ethics, I think we're trying to generate a standard of human behavior that we can all agree on. And those are really coming from opposite directions. One's top down, one's bottom up. And our job is to try to work out the messiness in between, to try and find common ground.
Yeah. As Gandhi said, an eye for an eye leaves the entire world blind. And that's the fact. But,
yeah, well, and in fact, I'll tell you that in the rabbinic literature, when the Torah says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the sages interpret that to mean financial compensation. You evaluate the amount of damage, and it's civil restitution. Yeah. Whereas in some cultures, it has been taken in the other direction, right? You steal, you get your hand cut off. And that does, of course, lead to Gandhi's observation, which is one that is ultimately destructive to a society rather than beneficial. But we'll pause here and wrap up this segment. But thank you all for as you said, Anne, an unexpected direction that we've taken here. But that's why we're here, because the meeting of minds yields new truths, new insights, new perspectives. So JC Glick, always a pleasure. And Nevel, good to have you back. And Andre van Heerden, glad you could join us for this time. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information. Submit your idea. If it's something compelling, we will take it up for a future issue, future episode. And until then, as always, encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.